Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this presentation on HLC's criteria for accreditation, Criterion 4. My name is Christine Engel. I'm with the Higher Learning Commission. I also have Denise Clark here helping us with technology. And today you'll be hearing from Stephanie Brzuzzi, who is a Vice President for Accreditation Relations with HLC, and Rex Ramsier, who is with the University of Akron. Just a quick reminder, you can type questions in the dialog box that you see in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will read those questions out at the end. And with that, I will let Steph and Rex take it away.
Okay, good morning, everyone. This is Stephanie Brzuzzi. Again, I am a VP for Accreditation Relations with the Higher Learning Commission. I've been with the Commission for about 8 years. So I want to welcome everybody to the call. We really appreciate your time. If it's morning for you, for some people it might be just starting the afternoon, so thanks for joining us. Again, as Christine said, this is Criterion 4, and until 3 weeks ago, we would have been calling this revised criteria. Now it is the criteria. So we have now made the shift. So these are now the criteria going forward, and we'll talk about some of the changes today. The most important, as you want to see in the next couple of slides, Criterion 4 didn't change much. There was some minor changes to language, but in terms of any significant changes, we did not do that. One reason for that is 4A and 4B work quite well for us and have been very successful. 4C, we are in the process of thinking how to evaluate retention, persistence, completion, and we have been studying that for the last couple of years. That criteria may get revised in the next year or so, but for now it is still, as you can see, and when we get there, fairly aspirational in terms of goals. Okay, next slide, please. So as you can see, this little slide is just to remind you that the revised criteria effective September 1st, 2020. And this is where it looks, you can still see this on our webpage, and it gives you some important information about our process. It gives you the new criteria booklet. It also, most importantly, gives you the crosswalk. And I think that's the next slide. There we go. There it is. You'll see in that the crosswalk, and this explains to you the changes. And as you can see, for Criterion 4, there's no change in terms of the components. Again, there's some minor revisions in language, but this is a nice little visual expression of what we've done, and you'll be able to take a look at that. Next slide. So Criterion 4, let's talk about it. The institution demonstrates responsibility for the quality of its educational programs, learning environments, and support services, and it evaluates their effectiveness for student learning through processes designed to promote continuous improvement. So this is the overall what we expect from Criterion 4. Next slide. Core component 4A, let's start there. The institution ensures the quality of its educational offerings. Now, the overall importance of this is that we are doing what we consider quality education at the higher ed university, what we expect for college degree level. Next slide. And you'll notice the core component, if we give an overview, these are the things that we expect. Regular program review process should be in place at your institution. You should be evaluating the quality of all transcripted credit. You maintain and exercise authority over your prerequisites, dual credit courses, rigor of courses, expectations for student learning, and faculty qualifications. Specialized accreditation for certain programs is maintained, and you have there is an evaluation process of the success of your graduates. And Rex is going to join me here now and talk about evidence, how you might prove this to the commission.
Thanks, Steph. This is Rex Ramsier from University of Akron. Welcome, everyone. So HLC, and you'll see a picture of it here, has a really useful resource that's posted on its website, and we also have it, I think, here as a handout. This is a really great document for those of you who are putting together assurance arguments or focus visit reports, et cetera, on examples of evidence that we'll touch on a few of today to give you an idea what the teams are looking for. So let's move to the next slide. So under 4A, again, program review is one of the expectations. The types of evidence that you may have that you wish to include in your reports would be things like, of course, guidelines. What are the guidelines for your program review process? Many campuses will have templates so that the documents generated by the departments, have a common look and feel. It's not required, of course, but many will have those. Usually there's a posted cycle. The criterion is not specific about, it just says regular program review. It doesn't say how often. So you have the ability as a campus to decide. Many campuses will be 5 years, some are 3, some are 7, some are aligned with some kind of state mandated cycle, etc. Usually there's some sort of reviewing bodies, okay? If there's some kind of a committee been formed that actually looks at these reports that are generated by the programs. Many will have common data sets, maybe generated by an institutional research office, say for enrollment and things like that, or budgets. Some campuses use external reviewers for program review. It's not a requirement by HLC, but some states actually require external review. So that can be another dimension, and those reports could be part of your evidence file. Many schools will do benchmarking with respect to their peers. Somewhere probably there's a repository, some kind of a place where you keep your self-studies, reports from the bodies that reviewed them. Most obviously important is the actions taken, based on the program reviews. And in some cases, some units will have external advisory boards, maybe made up of company reps, businesses, employers, and even program review can involve curricular review as well in some cases. So just some ideas of what you might look for in trying to build your evidence file. On the topic of transcripted credit, of course, every campus needs to have a policy for how they accept and evaluate transfer credits from other institutions. Prior learning assessment, some campuses have a mechanism for this. Of course, advanced placement, CLEP. There's also ACE, there's military credit, credit by exam, again, listed here. What's your process for doing that? Your international office or center may have, some good information to include in your evidence file for how they evaluate international transcripts. Usually a student handbook or catalog is a good resource as an evidence, evidentiary filing in your assurance argument. Some campuses will have articulation agreements. These could be with, for certificate-based type training where you have block credit transfer or actual course-to-course or certain training modules, say the YMCA CPR course articulates for a certain phys ed requirement in your curriculum. Those can be course-to-course. Course equivalency guides could be posted in your either transfer office or in your admissions area. Then those could also be good resources for your evidence. And of course, there's always transcripts. Now, we're not suggesting that you're providing student transcripts in your documentation, but there's always a chance, and I have seen some cases where we had to actually look at transcripts to see if students that was on site, certainly not electronic. So let's go to the next slide. So some of the other subcomponents in 4A, you're responsible for the academic integrity of your courses and programs. This usually, how you can provide evidence that you're maintaining integrity could be through the reviews of your curriculum. internal, and some campuses actually, again, use external reviewers on a certainly not every year, but maybe every 5 years. Substitutions, if you have a curriculum and a lot of times things like substitutions and and prerequisites, these may arise as issues with in the students from students saying that they don't get to take the classes that they're supposed to take, that there's a lot of substitutions. So you may want to look at that just to see if you think that you're sort of within the boundaries of trying to offer the classes that students need for the certain degree. Compliance, a lot of times we have programs that have licensure, for example, in certain states, education, health professions, or external accrediting agencies. And those are really great places to look for evidence for your HLC reports. If you're in compliance with the expectations of state and external accreditors, that's evidence that you're maintaining your integrity. Many times you have a curriculum approval process that can be a good resource for evidence. It demonstrates that if a new program is approved on the campus, it's been properly vetted, that some kind of faculty review has made sure the integrity is there. This also goes with respect to how you hire faculty and what their credentials are. Again, the integrity of the program is driven by the credentials of the faculty. And finally, dual enrollment, which has become a really big thing in the last several years. How are you maintaining the quality and integrity of courses that are taught to mostly high school students? So next slide. So one of the subcomponents is about specialized accreditation. Now, of course, in some areas, again, like education and healthcare, specialized accreditation may be necessary, in particular to gain certain licensure. But in other cases, it's optional, right? There's many accrediting agencies that there's no license associated with it, like for business schools, for example. But if a campus, has accreditation, then of course evidence can be drawn from there to say, okay, well, what's your status, right? Are you in good standing? How's the program doing? Has it been monitoring? Have there been any sanctions? In particular, of course, we're always looking for evidence that if there were any issues found, what actions were taken to remedy the issues and get back to what's expected in that discipline. So that can be another resource for you to add to your HLC evidence. And then last in the subcomponents is success of graduates. This is a difficult one. How do you gauge how many students were employed after they graduated? How many were going for advanced degrees? Many times these are self-reported data, but that's still data, and we have to use what we have. You may have other places to look. There may be certain fellowship programs that you strive to place students in. You should have evidence on the success rate, and internships, special programs. Maybe you have certain, in a faith-based institution, one of the goals is to place students in missionary positions. Well, there should be maybe there's some evidence that shows you're successful in doing that. Maybe Peace Corps, maybe Vista, and others that you can think of. Again, a lot of this type of evidence can come from surveys of exit surveys of students, alumni surveys 6 months out, or multiple years out. In some cases, again, mentioning education and health professions, you have results from licensure certifications, similar to like passage of bar school passage rates for law schools. So that's all evidence that can speak to success of your graduates. Some campuses and some disciplines actually are better at employer feedback than others, but that's good evidence. You may have a business school that has a large advisory council of employers that can provide valid feedback on success of graduates from the program. And so, having a process to try to track your students and trying to improve it again is kind of part of the challenge, right? But you just have to work with what you have. So I think based on that, we'll move to the next slide and probably back to Steph. Let me go over this one too. Sorry. So we decided to embed an example of a piece of assurance argument narrative here. So I'll just read it real quickly. So the institution, this is speaking to the program review subcomponent, maintains a program review process which involves faculty and administrators with oversight by, in this case, a university assessment council. And the blue then, of course, would be linking to some evidence in your file. Reviews are completed every 5 years, which goes to the regular part, evaluated by the appropriate faculty committees, and then, of course, the provost and, in this case, a board of directors. And then speaking to actions taken, most recent reviews resulted in calls for specific action related to deficiencies in assessment and 2 recommendations for program discontinuation. In addition, annual assessment reporting is now rolled into the 5-year program reviews. And we added this in because many campuses have sort of some difficulty understanding the distinction between assessment of learning outcomes, which is 4B, and program review, which is in 4A. Now they can be coupled, of course, and that's what this is indicating here, that the assessment can actually be rolled up into the program review. That's just an example of how one campus did it, at least. Okay, now we'll hand it back to Steph.
Okay, let's move on now to core component 4B. The institution engages in ongoing assessment of student learning as part of its commitment to the educational outcomes of its students. And again, it's very important here that the institution engages in ongoing assessment. Rex will get into some of the pitfalls of 4B later, but that is one thing that does come up quite often, is that people will have a good assessment plan, they'll even implement it for a couple of years, but they don't maintain it, and they don't get to that culture of assessment, and that can be a real pitfall for schools. So next slide, please. Some of the things we're looking for in this core component are effective processes for the assessment of student learning, both academic and co-curricular. When we talk about here with co-curricular, it's important that it is somehow related to what's important to the outcomes of those students when they leave your campus. So is everything a co-curricular activity that needs to be assessed? No. The question there is, it depends. It depends on what your outcomes are for your students. So should some co-curricular activities be part of assessment? Yes. Do all of them need to be? No. So for some, for example, let's say extracurricular sporting activities are very integral to what's trying to be achieved in the outcomes academically when that student leaves that campus, or for the kind of whole person of the student. You would want to see some assessment there. However, if they're an activity for students that really isn't central to necessarily the mission of your institution and what you want to see your students come out with, then no, you wouldn't be assessing them. Utilizes information gained from assessment to improve student learning. It's not enough to gather it. It's important that you use it for improvement. Processes and methodologies to assess student learning reflect good practice, including the substantial participation of faculty, instructional, and other relevant staff members. Next slide. And I'll turn it back to you, Rex.
So some examples of evidence that you may look for in your own reporting. So with respect to the effective processes for assessment, many campuses will have a published assessment plan. It could be campus-wide, it could be at the unit level. Again, many campuses will use some sorts of templates so that the assessment reports, have a similar look and feel. Again, not required, but if you have them, that's part of your evidence. And again, usually some kind of a cycle of what you're going to assess and when you're going to assess it. And that will help you avoid pitfall we'll talk about later. So student learning outcomes, of course, these can be with respect to your general education program, for each course, for the program as a whole, and at the institutional level. Again, you will have student learning outcomes for co-curricular activities. And as Steph mentioned, you don't need them for every single thing that happens on campus. Each campus has to decide what they really believe contributes in a co-curricular way to the overall outcomes they're looking for their students, and then assess only those ones. And student learning outcomes generally need to be known to the students. They, for example, could be on syllabi, so students, understand going in, what they're expected to learn and demonstrate that they know and can do, after a course or after the gen ed program they've completed it, or after they completed their degree. In many cases, some of these are driven by external accreditation. Those in some cases are some of the easier ones because you have to do it already for that purpose. But as Steph said earlier, having a plan and maintaining it and continuing on it ongoing is really part of the important here. So many disciplines will use rubrics in order to be able to gauge or measure success on the student learning outcomes that you've defined. There can be curricular maps, can be one mechanism, or crosswalks through which you build your evidence that you're doing assessment on an ongoing basis. Again, most assessment processes will have direct measures and indirect measures. You can certainly use both types for evidence that you're doing the work. Many times, of course, there'll be annual reports that are generated by the units, maybe by reviewing bodies. Normally, the faculty in the program would be looking at the results of their own course and program assessments to learn from them and hopefully make changes. There may also be assessment committee on campus, or this work may fall to a standing curriculum committee. Each institution's has the ability to decide what process they use. Some will have a committee of the faculty senate or the university council, whatever you call that body on your campus. Again, it's not required to have these, but this is the normal place for you to look to see if you can find evidence that this is ongoing. Many campuses will have an assessment office, a coordinator, a director of some kind that tries to pull all this together. And again, data are really the key here, demonstrating that data are being generated for assessment purposes. And then, of course, that those data are being used to make changes, for the better. So with that, we'll move to the next slide. So closing the loop, this is where the action part comes in. If you've demonstrated you've collected a lot of data, where do you find evidence that you've actually used it? So some can come from employers, again, from disciplines that have, say, industrial advisory groups or a lot of connection with the employers of their students. That you may have mechanisms to get feedback and make changes to the curriculum based on that. Again, in certain areas, you have success rate on licensure exams that can be very helpful as far as evidence. Changes you make to your curriculum based on assessment. This is one that may be overlooked by many campuses, but most campuses have a semi or very formal mechanism to change your curriculum, to modify your courses or your degree programs. Many times those are done because of what someone learned from assessment. And if you track that, then it's really great evidence that you're actually using the assessment information to make changes to the curriculum. And it could be as simple as a curriculum proposal, has a little box to check that, this change is based on an assessment, etc. Making revisions to the learning outcomes themselves is evidence, okay, that you learned from what you from the assessment data and modified the learning outcomes accordingly, or you modify the measures that you use for that learning outcome, or the rubrics that help you show if you met the measures. So these are all ways to generate evidence that there's action happening. And of course, you can always look for, if you have faculty meetings or reviewing bodies that are looking at the program level, at gen ed program, et cetera, agendas, okay, of those meetings, minutes from those meetings can also be evidence that there are discussions happening around the data, there are changes being proposed, and that's an ongoing process. Again, those help to show that the last time the committees met wasn't 2017, right? That there's some kind of a ongoing process. With respect to participation, again, would look for agendas and minutes of the people that are participating in assessment. You could have, you may have a campus, say, with a Center for Teaching and Learning that offers training. Well, there's evidence, right? If you have a published set of workshops when they were happening, hopefully you've sort of counted how many people attended, et cetera. That can be good evidence. How you hire your faculty, right? Is assessment part of the faculty hiring process? Is it mentioned in letters of offer? If so, well, it could very well be. That's good evidence. Same with the evaluations of faculty. Is there evidence that annual evaluations take into account faculty participation in assessment activities? If you happen to be lucky enough to have an assessment office, those people probably are keeping records of how many people have come for training, how many people have come for help, et cetera, and how many maybe they outreach and they go out to the departments to have face-to-face meetings to help people understand assessment. They would have hopefully records of all that activity. Instructional designers, especially now in today's world with everybody moving online, these are professionals on your campus that can have quite a lot of positive input with respect to assessment on how to do certain things with your courses now that most of us had to redesign. So don't forget to look to those people. Of course, it's good that you have chairs and your deans and the provost be knowledgeable about assessment, be involved at some level in participating in the process. And for the co-curricular piece in particular, your student affairs personnel are really the ones that are primarily involved there, and try to talk to them, see what they're doing, and try to help them understand the kinds of evidence that you need to demonstrate that the co-curricular part of assessment is also being done on an ongoing basis. So with that, I think we'll give it back to Steph.
Okay, thanks, Rex. Core component 4C, and this is the final component in criteria 4. The institution pursues educational improvement through goals and strategies that improve retention, persistence, and completion rates in its degree and certificate programs. Next slide, please. And what we're looking for in core component 4C is define goals for retention, persistence, and completion. That you are collecting data and that you're analyzing information on retention, persistence, and completion. The institution uses the information for improvements. The institution's processes and methodologies reflect good practice. And as I said, this one is the one we've been doing a lot of research on to see if we can improve it to give better guidance here on some of the expectations and outcomes for core component 4C. And I think with that, next slide is to Rex.
So again, back to examples. Again, as Steph mentioned, this one's difficult for campuses, and hopefully will be some improvements. But for now, let's work with what we have. campuses have the ability to define the metrics that they're going to measure. So persistence, completion, and retention are just words. You don't have to follow IPEDS with respect to retention, for example. But each campus needs to figure out what it is they're trying to measure, okay? And try to have, and look, again, in the case of trying to put a report together, look for evidence that there's consistent terminology being used, that people, when they say, for example, retention, everyone's talking about the same thing. That's a goal, okay? So strive for something like that. Whatever these metrics are that have been defined, of course, need to be measurable. And certainly, again, the reason that, that's non-prescriptive, the criterion subcomponent, is because, that needs to be tailored to the institution, and not just the institution itself, but it could be down to the program or even student subgroups, okay? There could be, you have certain retention or completion or other metrics, that you're trying to attain, for subpopulations of your student body. That's perfectly fine, okay? But again, it just needs to be defined and also measurable. There should be a starting point, so that would be, some kind of baseline or current data for each of these metrics. I think, these are aspirational or ambitious goals should be set. One thing that's important, I think, is self-consistency. So what I mean by that is, if you have, every program hoping to improve retention by, 3 percentage points, but the campus goal is to improve retention by 5 percentage points. Well, something doesn't add up, right? Because if every program, is doing better by a certain amount, it should all roll up to something at the campus level or the college level, for example. So look for self-consistency. That's an important part. With respect to the data collection and analysis, so many campuses will have some kind of a standardized or centralized place where these data are pooled and analyzed. An institutional research office or institutional effectiveness area. If you're lucky to have the staffing for that. So look there for evidence. Data governance is a thing that's become more and more important on campuses. Who has access to the data, and is everyone using common data that everybody believes in, or is everyone sort of making up sort of their own definitions? And that's, again, the data governance is an important piece. So you may have, actually, there's some places have a data governance officer that could be a real good resource for your evidence. A lot of campuses will look, are already looking at, large DFW classes where students are not succeeding, and trying to measure, what's the success rate and how to improve those courses. There's ways to look at data from, how many students are on academic probation and for how long. Academic suspension is another place where you can generate data to try to identify what the campus considers to be, problem areas that you want to address. Another type of measure that you don't see very often, but it can be helpful, is credits earned versus attempted. So many times students will take classes, and not really maintain, if they don't maintain standards of progress to a certain point, financial aid will kick in with flagging them. But this is another type of data that can be used to show that you're trying to improve the percentage of credits that students actually earn that they have attempted. Some pretty rich data I've seen can come from sequence courses. So you have a part 1 and a part 2. Looking at the success of the students in the part 2 can be helpful to identify areas that you may improve in part 1, even if a lot of students passed part 1 if they weren't prepared for part 2. So that's what this refers to. Again, these are just ideas that you may find are relevant on your campus or not. And the data, how is it disseminated, right? If there's a central office that collects it, hopefully it's being pushed out to the appropriate units, to reviewing committees or the provost or somebody to be used. Okay, so that's another thing that you'd want to look for in your evidence. Next slide. And then, of course, after it gets pushed out, how's it used, right? This is always the key is you have data, now you have evidence. Was it used for something? So again, looking for evidence to demonstrate that it was used would again come from things like agendas or minutes of meetings, action items placed on maybe the dean's council or the chair's council, discussion. Is there follow through? You have someone tracking whether or not the changes that were made actually influence the metric that you are measuring. A lot of times you can get some good information from your advising group. If you do have a centralized advising office, it could be that they actually can provide evidence that they've been able to assist students, in choosing different electives, different math pathways, for example, is a common one, to improve their completion or success rates, by avoiding, for example, avoiding algebra track if you only need statistics for your major. Those are simple things, it seems like, but sometimes it's easy to overlook that the advising office may actually have a lot of good evidence. Enrollment management, if you have such an office or a person on your campus, they may be able to provide evidence as well that they are working to recruit the types of students that would be more successful in certain disciplines, for example. Have there been any rules or policies changed or modified recently on the campus that would help or hinder, unfortunately, student success in the sense of retention, completion, et cetera? And what I refer to here are things like policies on academic probation or suspension, right? How many times students can withdraw from the same class, how many times students can repeat the same class for a change of grade. These sorts of rules and policies can affect the outcomes, okay, which in this case would be, how well students are progressing to degree. And if your campus has had the funding to implement any new support services for students, it could very well be that that's evidence that you're trying, you've learned something from your analyses, and you're really trying to help students by starting up a new effort to provide them more support in a different way. Again, shouldn't really speak to best practices here. Good practices is what we're looking for. These examples above, again, I think help you see what kind of evidence you could use to show that your campus is doing what it can in this regard. Benchmarking can be helpful. Some schools do that very routinely. There are consortia across in some states and also across the nation on this. TRIO has a great student success program. And of course, there's national organizations and a lot of initiatives around student retention and completion persistence. And of course, Higher Learning Commission has all kinds of good resources in this regard, including the workshops that they put on. So, so again, I think this hopefully gives you an example or some examples, things to think about as you put your reports together for the future. And we'll move to the next slide. I think this is the pitfalls one. Yep. So we went back to 4B only because you'll see on the following slide that the 4B is the most cited for monitoring. And so some potential pitfalls that I think that people should think about with respect to assessment, which is 4B, is campuses don't have to assess everything. Okay, and you don't have to assess everything every semester. A lot of schools seem to get off to a good start, as Steph said. They have a plan, and then they just can't maintain it. And sometimes it just appears the campuses just burn out, right? Because they start off thinking they're going to measure everything about everything, every semester, every year. And the criteria don't say you have to do that, right? So it just says you have to have an ongoing process. So our suggestion, or my suggestion here, is as a campus, decide what's most important. Really think hard about what do you really care about your students, learning and being able to do. Okay, and then once you've figured out those, what I would consider to be a few things, then how can you best assess those things? Okay, and have a plan, be methodical, so almost dogmatic, and stick to it. Again, maybe you pick one learning outcome a year, right? And if you only have 3 or 4, well, then you measure one a year for 4 years, and that's a cycle. Rather than thinking you have to do it all the time, because that just leads to burnout. So, and again, as I mentioned earlier, we're not suggesting you strive for best practice. It needs to be meaningful to your campus. Not to any other group. It needs to be meaningful to the institution itself. It doesn't have to be fancy. Now, some of us are lucky. We have the ability to have all kinds of nice software and ways of packaging our materials, but it isn't about being fancy. It needs to inform change for the better. Okay, that's the key here. Is assessment's supposed to be about improving the learning of our students, and not trying to keep up with the Joneses, if you will. So maybe that helps a little bit for campuses to think about sort of what's really important, and get cut to the chase, and then put your evidence there to show that this is something that you're doing that really matters to you and to your students. And with that, I think I'll give it back to Steph to talk about the data.
So we added just a few slides at the end to give you a sense of we monitor every year since 2013 what are the most cited core components for either monitoring, which is if you receive a met with concern. There's essentially 3 outcomes for each core component, the criteria and the criteria overall. You can be met, you are meeting the standards that we expect, you're in compliance with the criteria. You can be met with concern, which means it will automatically require some type of monitoring. We think there are some possible weak areas that could put you at risk in the future for being out of compliance. And one of the requirements of being in good standing is that you're always in compliance. And if you get a met with concern, it does require monitoring of some sort, or not met. And that means you are out of compliance, and that requires a different outcome. So in this case, if you can see the met with concerns are not met, 4B is the #1 every year, pretty much. About 40% of folks, institutions end up with some type of monitoring, and that's been fairly consistent. The lowest it's ever gone is about 30%. Last year we were sitting at the 40%. So that's why it's very important to have that continuous assessment, culture of assessment on your campus, because that is very often what happens is there's a break. Schools lose a lot of ground, and they're really not assessing learning outcomes the way they need to. The other areas are 5A, 5C. You can also see 4A and 4C are here as well. So criteria 4 is basically all components are represented in the top. Now it's much lower when you get to 4C, 4A and 4C, but nonetheless, these are still the top most cited ones. Next page. And these are some additional core components that get cited. 5D works to improve performance, appropriate degree programs, faculty, governance, integrity, governing board. And you will have a copy of the slides so you can go back and take a look at these. And finally, I think we're ready for questions. This is where you can always find additional information. As you know, go to our website. Everything you need is there. Also, if you have other questions when you get off the phone today, be sure and contact your liaison like me for your school, as they can answer these questions for you as well. And I think we'll turn it back to you, Christine.
Great, thanks so much to both of you for that. And yeah, we do have a couple of questions, so I'll go ahead and read them out. The first question we have, Is there a sense of how many institutions share assessment data and reports with the institution's Board of Trustees or Board of Directors?
That's interesting. And Rex, I'll let you hit that as well. We don't require it, but some do. And so it really depends on the institution. It's like I said, it's not a requirement, but it's a powerful way to close the loop. Because if assessment data often goes back to boards, they can act on it in terms of designation of money, resources to seek improvements. So I've seen good outcomes when the data goes that far. I couldn't tell you how many. Rex, do you have a sense?
No, I don't actually. I think that you're right in the cases where I've seen that. Generally, that tends to be a positive feedback loop that the board is paying attention to the program quality. So, but again, it's not a requirement. It's only a suggestion that if things like that do go to your board, that's great evidence for your campus.
Great. So what part of 4B is most cited, 1, 2, or 3?
Well, actually, the core component itself is is what gets cited or met with concerns not met, not the subcomponents. So that we don't actually track the which subcomponent are the most cited, unless maybe Steph has more information on that.
No, you're absolutely right. We only look at it as the overall component. And the reason for that is subcomponents, excuse me, I lost my voice there for a minute. Subcomponents aren't always relevant to every institution. So even though folks write to them, if they're relevant, they aren't always. So we really look at the overall component.
Thanks. The next question. What does HLC expect schools to be doing on an annual basis for learning outcomes assessment? If we had a plan to do a comprehensive learning outcomes review for programs on a 5-year cycle, reviewing 12 programs a year, and plans to implement and follow up on action points each year between those comprehensive reviews, does that meet the standard, or are we lacking in our annual part of the cycle?
That's a good question. It sounded to me like that there was some annual process. Now, again, the criteria aren't specific as to, there has to be something done. It's on the assessment piece, it's supposed to be ongoing. So I guess you have to think about if you do something only once every 5 years, is it really ongoing? But I think the question actually had it embedded in it that there was something annual.
Yeah, I would look at that the same way. There sounds like there's a continuous process. There was an annual piece. So as long as that's happening, then we don't really dictate how you do it, but we do want to see that it's being done on a continuous basis.
Right, and the HLC is always, lets it mostly up to the institution to decide how they want to do something. But then, we're looking for whether or not the institution followed what it said it was going to do, right? So, so I would just keep that in mind. It's really not very prescriptive if you really read the actual criteria itself.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left, but that's all the questions I had so far. So we'll give it another couple of minutes to see if anyone else has a question. While we're waiting to see if anyone else wants to ask something, Steph, Rex, any other thoughts you'd like to share about Criterion 4?
No, I really can't think of any. I guess, seeing, that all three of the subcomponents are, amongst the top 5, most cited for monitoring. So, 4 tends to give campuses a lot of trouble. We hope that these lists of examples and that resource site or the resource pages that you have in the handouts are really, really useful. So campuses I really suggest you go and look at those. This don't make it any harder than it has to be, I guess, maybe is my advice. The key here is to demonstrate that you're you're doing the measurements, you're getting the data, and then you're doing something with it. That's really the key. And again, it doesn't have to be everything all the time. It simply has to be something that is meaningful to the campus, and it doesn't have to be scary. I think that people get really 4B in particular tends to make campuses nervous, and just follow your process, and that's what we're looking for, is evidence that again, it's a good practice, right? And it's helping the campus improve, and that's really always been the driver.
Yeah, I would say I support everything that Rex just said. That's all absolutely true. And I really do encourage you to go to the providing evidence document and utilize it. It's very helpful, well thought out. We've spent a lot of time on it, had a lot of input from peer reviewers, and I think it's very good. And I just want to emphasize what Rex said too about we're really not prescriptive. We want it to be something that works for you, that's based on your mission and what you consider quality. We want you to be able to prove to us that it indeed is, and that you follow through on what you do, and you have evidence that shows that you follow through on what you said you're going to do. But how you get there is really up to you. And part of the role of the liaison is that we work with schools and our peer reviewers to make sure that is that we're not too prescriptive, that it isn't about how somebody's doing it on their campus. It's about what works on yours.
Great, we do have another question. Do you have any examples of methods to assess general education programs such as the GRE, ETS proficiency profiles, or other internal options that might be available?
Rex, do you have some thoughts about that, being on a campus?
Well, I mean, the ones that were just mentioned are certainly good ones. A lot of gen ed programs will have, it's quote own learning outcomes, and a lot of those are homegrown. The ones that I've seen that I'm thinking of right now off the top of my head are really internal to the campus, usually not using sort of external validation, simply because of the nature of gen ed. Is usually very institutionalized, which is appropriate. So I really can't think of any other mechanisms except the two that were mentioned, which are good ones. But many times I think that the gen ed piece is really driven by the institution's mission and culture. So I don't know if that helps very much or not, but that's been my experience.
Is HLC still working on clarifying expectations of institutions with respect to co-curricular assessment?
We are not. We have tried to give some examples, and again, we're at the point where we want to give people the flexibility. What we need to see is that if the co-curricular activities matter to the learning and at the institution, that they are indeed following through with assessment. Rex, do you have some thoughts there?
Well, I think that the example you gave earlier was a good one about some campuses, the role of athletics is really important, where a huge fraction of the student body are student athletes as well. Others could be like service learning. Suppose that a campus has a real investment and interest in its mission to have students involved with service learning. Well, those are primarily co-curricular activities. That would be one that the campus would presumably identify itself, that this is really important to us, and when we're going to measure, we're doing it for a reason. It's connected to our curriculum, and it really shapes what our graduates look like when they leave our institution, and that's why it's so important. So we're going to decide what we need to measure. I think in the past, it sort of started out, at least in my recollection, that co-curricular sort of came, sort of after the curricular part, and everyone was imagining, oh my goodness, we have to measure everything. The comedian who comes into the dorm on Wednesday night, and the tailgate party before the big rivalry football game. No, campuses have to just sort of take 2 steps back and think about co-curricular a little bit differently. It's not everything is co-curricular, and even if it is, you don't have to measure everything. You just have to decide about the important ones. So, I don't know. I hope that helps to try to, again, it's HLC's very, very non-prescriptive in this regard, right? It just says that there has to be some ongoing assessment in co-curricular. It doesn't even give a percentage of, sort of how many activities. It's simply pick the ones that are the most important. In some campuses, it may be really relatively straightforward. We tried to give you a few examples of how that might look. In other campuses, maybe it's not so straightforward, but you need to decide, what really matters to your campus culture, and what affects the students. How do people recognize your students when they've graduated? And if there's a co-curricular piece that helps them, gain those skills or those viewpoints, then those are the ones that I'd suggest you put on the list for assessment purposes.
Okay, what is an acceptable framework for Gen Ed? Is a distribution requirement still acceptable? And by distribution requirement, they mean, XYZ credits of math, X credits of science, etc.
Yeah, I wouldn't, I certainly, HLC doesn't define, acceptable, if you will. Many states that I'm aware of, still have these expectations of, there's a minimum number of credits in the Gen Ed quote section that includes, so many credits of math, English, natural science, humanity, social science. Certainly those are acceptable. It's, again, non-prescriptive, but there are some schools that have completely different view of what a Gen Ed program looks like, and that's okay too, right? I mean, it's the institution has to decide. Now, a lot of schools like mine, we're part of a state system, so we have constraints with respect to what ours needs to look like, which has its pros and cons. But the distribution requirement model is certainly valid in several states I can think of off the top of my head, because it's really state driven.
Yeah, we don't weigh in on that. What we do, it's absolutely right. I mean, you have to be able to explain to us how it fits into your student learning outcomes model for your graduates, but how you do it and what you do is really school specific, and it really does vary across the board. What I will say in the assumed practices is for an undergraduate degree, for example, 4-year, we require 120 credits as we think of traditional credit hours as they exist today. For an associate's degree, it has to be a minimum of 60 degrees and 60 credits, excuse me. And for a master's degree, it has to be a minimum of 30 credits. So those all stand as assumed practices, but beyond that, we don't weigh in.
Thank you. And we did have someone mention the AAC and U value rubrics, I believe, in reference to general education.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And again, there's a lot of resources out there from some of the other national organizations that have really focused on, Gen Ed and what does it mean. Again, but the campuses, each have to adopt their own, Gen Ed program depending on what their culture and mission is. But yeah, those are certainly good resources.
Great. Well, it looks like that's about all of the time that we have for today. I want to say thanks again to Steph and Rex for this presentation today. And again, we just wish you all the best in this difficult time. Please do feel free to reach out to us if you have any further questions, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Yep. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.